The BBC Panorama documentary on HMP Northumberland, which aired last night, which was the 13th of February 2017, told a story that's been known by criminologists and forensic psychologists for a long time now. First, our prisons are overcrowded, underfunded, and there aren't enough staff to maintain effective control. Added to that now, though, was the detrimental effect that the profit motive is having on prison facilities and efforts to successfully rehabilitate prisoners. What I want to do in this podcast is to look at how we might start to change prisons for the better. I want to start by saying that these problems with the prison service aren't, as some people are trying to suggest, purely a result of drives to cut costs and privatise another public service. While this is obviously one of the key issues facing Northumberland, this podcast is about more than just one prison. The whole way that we view incarceration, punishment and rehabilitation needs to change. So here we go. I've got 4 key recommendations for improving the prison system, which are supported by research evidence in relation to the extent to which they can both produce people who are more likely than not to go on to live crime-free lives, and also to improve the prison environment more generally. So let's go through these. Recommendation 1 is a shift in focus. This is probably the most fundamental issue that we have to address, both as a prison system and as a society. Prison is a punishment. That is, we need to be firm when we say that people don't go to prison for punishment, they go to prison as punishment. All too often we're confronted by headlines about holiday camps, plush cells and Sky TV subscriptions. Whether or not these are present doesn't and really shouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The role of prison is to deprive people of their liberty. Everything that happens inside the prison, though, should be geared towards preparing people to live outside the prison with their liberty. When thinking about this from a psychological standpoint, we can consider 2 key models of rehabilitation. Now, the first is called the risk-need responsivity model, and this suggests that those who are at the highest risk of reoffending should receive the most therapeutic input, and only those factors that directly cause offending behaviour, they're called criminogenic needs, should be targeted through treatment. Now, a second approach to rehabilitation is called the good lives model. With this approach, the aim is to help people achieve things called primary human goods. Things like healthy living, having control over their own destiny, and being able to successfully join and function within communities. For too long, we've been focused on risk. I think it's about time we shifted our attention towards helping people to achieve good and non-offending lives. Recommendation 2 is to reduce the prison population. On a past episode of a BBC debate show, I can't remember exactly which one it was, there was a metaphor used to compare prisons to kind of acute hospital wards. Places that should only admit, for a want of a better word, those with the highest amount of needs. This makes sense, as many people who conduct research into prison reform refer to the so-called schools of crime theory, which suggests that low-level offenders who commonly serve sentences of less than 12 months essentially learn how to commit crimes in a more effective manner when they go to prison. This claim seems to have some resonance when you think about the reconviction rates following these short-term sentences. Around 60% of those serving less than a year in prison are found guilty of another offence within 12 months. For me, the answer to this problem is quite simple. What we should be doing is removing first and second time low-level offenders from the prison population altogether. It costs around £40,000 to keep one person in prison for 12 months, while an equivalent length community sentence, which incorporates community payback and psychological interventions, costs just £4,000. Add to this the relative reoffending rates for these 2 sentencing options. As I've said already, 60% for prison-based sentences of less than 12 months versus 30 to 35% for community alternatives. The cost saved on imprisonment can then be reinvested, and there is a more effective staff-to-prisoner ratio, which is a key issue damaging the prison environment at the moment. Recommendation 3 is proper purposeful activity within prisons. In the Panorama documentary, what we saw was prisoners undertaking so-called purposeful activity. And what were they doing? They were colouring in books of Peppa Pig. Not only is this offensive to taxpayers who fund prison-based education programmes, but it's also a total waste of time, both to staff and for prisoners. So what's the solution? Well, last night when I was watching the show, I sent out a tweet that said that I believe that prisons should be run essentially as small villages. And by this, what I mean is that they should have real jobs in real businesses and real education in real schools. Obviously, staffing for services where qualifications are needed, such as schools or medical facilities, need to be outsourced to either private providers or local authorities. But other businesses, such as a prison post office or a village shop, could be run primarily for prisoners and by prisoners. This approach would take the therapeutic community idea and expand on it. So at the moment we have a number of therapeutic communities within the prison service, and the most famous of this is probably HMP Grendon. These are prisons where the focus is on operating as a functioning community, with therapeutic input provided by all members of staff, whether they're psychologists or prison officers. This might sound like a soft approach to prison, but just take a look at the effectiveness of the approach. Only around 20% of Grendon prisoners reoffend within 18 months of release, which is around 1/3 of the average for the entire prison estate. If you still think that's too high, then maybe we should look further afield. How about Norway? One of their maximum security prisons, Halden, which is called the world's most humane prison. It houses high-level prisoners such as murderers, rapists and child molesters. And that has only a 20% reoffending rate, the same as Grendon, but much more dangerous inmates. While the island of Bastøy, which is another prison just off the coast of Norway, actually does operate as its own small village on an island. It has a reoffending rate of just 18%. Now that's 6 times lower than the European average of around 70%. In short, if you treat people in prison humanely and give them a proper sense of purpose, then the chances of them returning once released is significantly lowered. Now my final recommendation would be around democracy. Democracy in prisons is something that has been in the headlines on and off for some time now, with the legal challenge in 2013 to extend voting rights to prisoners. Now, while this was never going to be a good idea politically, by allowing some level of democracy in prisons, what we can do is to begin to make them into more realistic environments, and ones that mirror the type of environment that will be experienced by those not detained. It might be possible to introduce some kind of artificial democracy in line with the ideas I've already mentioned. So, for example, each prison would hold regular elections and vote for prisoners who would put themselves forward for specific roles within their prison community. This would get prisoners used to voting for people who subsequently have a responsibility for their well-being, and could also lead to some senior members of the prison population, for example those nearing the end of a long sentence, assuming positions of power and responsibility in preparations for their lives back out in the real community. What this does is again add to the sense of purpose that some lose when entering prison. By given a position of responsibility, this person may be afforded certain privileges for carrying out their role successfully, meaning that they're more motivated to conduct themselves properly in prison and also act as a positive role model for other prisoners. Of course, all this would need money. Some of this would take the form of reinvestment money saved from the switch from short-term prison sentences to community-based alternatives. However, converting the prison environment into a functioning community will need the government to provide some initial investment. However, the long-term savings to be made from reduced reoffending rates makes this a total no-brainer. The one thing that has to be central to this process, though, is cross-party support. By having a cross-party backing for this kind of switch, short-term political aims, such as winning the next election, won't hinder chances for real reform within the prison service. Now, this will probably face quite a lot of public backlash, and this is something that needs to be resisted by politicians, even at the expense of some electoral defeats, perhaps. It's time, though, I think, for our politicians to wake up and realise that only by looking at the evidence rather than the emotion of imprisonment is the best way to address our current prison crisis.